Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to the Oraculos podcast, where I bring you ancient wisdom for the modern mystic. I'm your host, Mychal A. Bryan, and joining me today is Ms. Nadine Jane. Nadine, how are you?
I'm so happy to be here. How are you?
I am so happy to have you here as well. It's been such a long time in the making. Like literally. So Nadine and I were, oh my God. So I've already started calling you Nadine because that's the Jamaican in me.
But that's my Australian side of the family, so let's roll with it. I like that.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So Nadine or Nadine was my intention. So let me just, so Nadine and I were supposed to do this interview earlier in the summer, and so much has happened since then, but I think that it's complete divine timing that we're able to get together now at the end of 2020 and just really check in. So I'm super stoked to be having this conversation with you today.
Me too. And on an eclipse of all days.
Oy vey.
I know, it's a pretty good day, I think, to do an interview.
So there's a lot going on.
Yes.
For those of you who this is your first time joining us here on the Oraculos podcast, this is a podcast where I bring you interviews from astrologers and mystics all around the world who aren't just changing their own lives through their astrological practice, but they're also actively changing this greater field of astrology that we all know and love. So if you want to continue to be a part of the magic and the momentum that we're building here on the Oraculos podcast, please do give yourself a moment, go down below, like this amazing video if you're watching it on YouTube, as well as subscribe to the Oraculos podcast. And as always, share this podcast with your other astrologically and magically minded friends, because more and more people need to know about the amazing work that astrologers like Nadine are doing in the world of astrology. So, Nadine, once again, thank you so much for being here right now. And first of all, what's the weather like where you are?
You're right, it is cold. It is in the 30s. It's winter in Maine, so we are just at the beginning of probably, some crazy cold weather. So I would say 30 is not that bad if you talk to other people who live in Maine.
Well, in the Bahamas, we never see 30 degrees at all. So 30 degrees in the Bahamas would literally be like the Polar Vortex. So
Yeah, what is it for you right now?
right now, it is a chilly 70 degrees.
Oh, that sounds really nice. I know, after living in New York for so I'm originally from California, by the way. But when I lived in New York for 7 years, then we've lived in Maine for a year. And I keep having that California feeling of why am I living? Like, why am I going through another winter? But it isn't, it's really exciting to see the seasons change. That's not something that I really got to see as much. So there's pros and cons, but yes.
Yeah. That's the way I feel about being in Illinois, because I spend quite a lot of time in Illinois, and it's so wonderful and so majestic to see the changing seasons, especially if you're from a place where that isn't naturally something that happens. But at the same time, it's like, okay, this snow was nice for all of 2 seconds. Take
Right.
it.
So true.
All right. So Nadine, you are an astrologer, and you are an astrologer on Instagram, which is where I found out about the amazing work that you're doing. And if you don't currently follow Nadine on Instagram, please go and check out her Instagram at Nadine Jane _astrology, where it's always soulful and heartfelt work. And it's also very aesthetically pleasing. So I want to know from you these two very specific sides of your life. One, your life as an astrologer, as well as your life as a designer. How did you get to be in astrology in the first place? And also, how did you get to be a designer? And how did those two things end up coming together?
That's a good question. It's also such a loaded question. So just tell me if you want me to stop myself, because it's
Go for it.
Bulky question. So I was an artistic, let me start from the very beginning. I was an artistic child, like I think many astrologers can be. It can be a creative practice, but yes, I was into drawing, specifically very much into drawing. And one of the weird things I actually think about in retrospect is I was obsessed with drawing planets, which I think is really funny, in the sense of maybe that was like the first time I was engaging with them without really realizing I knew nothing about Saturn. I just loved drawing the ring around Saturn over and over and over again. And then, yeah, I grew up in a family of academics. And so the idea of going out into the world and being an artist was just a non-starter. I mean, that was just not going to be acceptable. So I thought the most socially acceptable thing to do is to go try and be a graphic designer. It was the closest thing to art while still potentially being employable in my mind. And yes, I went to school for graphic design. I liked it. I was happy with it. I mean, it's an incredible skill to have from the standpoint of, as someone who was brought up drawing, it takes a number of hours. And the thing that I really loved about design is you could create something in 10 minutes if you wanted to on a computer with things like Photoshop. And that was my professional career up until my second Jupiter return. So when I was 24. And I moved to New York City a day after I graduated because I loved the city. I'd interned there. I felt like a lot of the jobs I was looking for were going to be in New York. I didn't want to design for tech, for example. So, the Bay Area made no sense to me. And yeah, I got a job as an art director at an agency, which was a silly job, to be honest with you, because I was 21 as an art director, which is it was a phony title, and I was making like $35,000 a year, which was barely livable in New York City at the time. And I was waitressing at night and yada, yada. And then I finally got a really cool job at this beauty company that's a startup named Glossier in New York City. And that's really where I feel like my career began. I was, the 23rd employee, and such a small team, whereas me and maybe maximum 5 other people building this website. And it was really design forward, which was really exciting. That's where I learned about brand integrity, because the founder, as well as the creative director, they just said, above all else, we don't want to produce necessarily we don't want to do performative marketing. We want this to be a truly thoughtful and innovative brand that sticks to its own values, which I thought was a really unique perspective from coming from an agency where it's just like, as long as your work can perform, then it's good work. So it felt like a very creative job. And around that time, to finally answer your question, I kind of started to get disillusioned with the design world from the perspective that it's very subjective. Someone can say, I like this typeface, and this other person can say, well, I like this typeface, and who's right? Like, neither person's right. And so it was like this huge ego game that I wasn't very good at playing, because I was very young. B, I just didn't want to argue with, I don't know, I felt like in order to be successful in that career, I was going to have to become more opinionated, more sort of showy of my skills. And it just felt like I was a total suddenly it started to feel like a square peg in a round hole of a career, basically. And simultaneously, like many young 20-somethings, I was going through a lot of psychological upheaval, processing a lot of stuff that I'd experienced when I was younger. I think also sometimes when people live in a big city, suddenly you're confronted with yourself. And I, like many people, discovered astrology during that period of time where, you hit some type of emotional bottom and you're like, can some practice explain to me what the hell is going on in my life? And it was purely a hobby. It was purely something that I just did out of passion and excitement. I knew nothing about it, obviously. In retrospect, I knew nothing. It's funny when you learn about all 12 signs, and when you start learning about the houses, you're like, I'm an astrologer. And it's in retrospect, it's like, no, not at all. There's so much more to learn. And by happenstance, I took a web design, or sorry, not a web design. I wanted to learn how to code. I was like, okay, so, design is boring to me. Maybe if I'm a designer and a developer, then I'll be excited about my career again. And in this web development class, the teacher said, your final project is a passion project. It can't be related to your 9 to 5 job. This was a night class. Can't be related to your 9 to 5. It has to be something that's your own. And so I was like, of course I'll make an astrology website. Cause like I said, I knew enough just to be curious about astrology. And, my friends loved the site. They were super excited about it, but I genuinely, and I really mean this genuinely, had no intention of it ever seeing the light of day. It was just something I was doing for fun. Fast forward to September 1st, 2017. Yes. I started doing readings, but then on September 1st, 2017, I was in a massive fight with my partner. We were long distance. He was in London, and it was, forget which holiday September 1st is, but it was some long weekend. Do you know what it is?
Is that Labor Day weekend?
Yeah, maybe Labor Day weekend. And everyone was out of town. I was alone for 4 days after this huge catastrophic fight with my partner. And I felt like I had too much energy to sit around and not do anything with my weekend. And so I decided to take the design system that I'd built for this website, turn it into an Instagram for my friends. Like literally that was my only intention, is like, they keep asking me what a rising sign, what a moon sign is, like all this kind of stuff. And then, you know, it ended up turning, you know, some miraculous way it ended up turning into a career. So it's a very millennial story, I would say, of becoming an astrologer. Like, I'm sure Lynn Bell will listen to this and be like, oh, you know what I mean? Like, but that's the truth. That's exactly what happened. I think that's what happens for a lot of people in the modern age, is like, some people, or I'll speak for myself, I almost feel like I was called an astrologer before I ever felt or identified as an astrologer, if that makes sense.
Definitely. And
Yeah.
it's funny that you mentioned Lynn, because Lynn is a good friend of mine, and and she and I just spoke a week ago, and that episode with Lynn and I is on the podcast. So if you haven't listened to it
I
already,
have to listen to, like, Lynn Bell is one of my greatest heroes. So if you want to, yes, listen to that episode.
I will let Lynn know.
Yes.
Right after we're finished.
So anyways, I hope that answers your question. It was just sort of like, that's how the worlds collided. Yeah.
It definitely does. And I think that it's really interesting how we come to this place of disillusionment, essentially, in terms of what it is we're doing out in the world. I remember when I was living in Jamaica, like fresh out of journalism school, and I did like another degree in marketing, and I got placed as marketing director for a graphic design studio in Jamaica. When I was around like 21 years old as well. So it's this figurative title that they give you to make you feel as if you actually have some sense of authority when you actually really don't. And it was crazy, but I became so disillusioned as I went to work every day wearing my tie and my button-up shirt, sitting behind 3 inches of glass, looking at the mountains in the distance, and just saying to myself, hey, what are you really doing here when you know that this box, this cubicle really doesn't serve your deepest spirit? And it was in that environment that I realized that I really just wanted to focus on my spiritual practice that I had done since my childhood and I had cultivated since I was a kid. But I knew that if it was one thing I wanted to do to make a living by, it was all of these spiritual tools that I had developed within myself. So it is a millennial story that you shared, but it's definitely a story of saying to yourself that I will not compromise on the things that truly feed my spirit anymore, because I realized that in order for me to make those compromises, I fundamentally have to kill something within myself in order to keep on showing up.
So true. Yeah. And out of curiosity for you, when did your astrology practice begin formally? Like, was it when you were in that other career, or when did you start to get serious about your own practice?
I had very specific experiences around the age of 11 and 12 where I fell into the correct information completely serendipitously. It wasn't because I felt as if I was going to become a professional anything. I was a kid watching Charmed and Harry Potter and the X-Men, and I wanted to have superpowers. And the closest thing I could find to having superpowers was to be able to tell the future. because I would stay up late in my grandmother's home, and I would watch Miss Cleo on television telling the future with her crystal ball and her tarot cards and her version of a quasi-astrology. So in my mind, of all of the powers that seems to be accessible, the only real power that I could possibly sink my teeth into was knowing how to use these tarot cards and knowing how to do some astrology. So I fell pretty head first into tarot and astrology around 11 and 12. And after I decided that those were things I was interested in, I started to meet people who were older than me who were already doing those things and exchanging information. And I just had a really young upbringing. And in the Bahamas, because it's such a rarity for anyone to be doing this, not even just a kid, but also an adult to be doing any sort of astrology or quote unquote fortune telling at all, I became pretty fucking popular in my neighborhood for being this one kid,
the go-to, right?
for being the go-to. And I think we all become a go-to for our friends and our neighbors as we step into this knowledge. But my mother would send her friends to me, then she sent her boss to me, and then it just blew up. And I never expected to be a professional astrologer or a tarot reader or anything, but it happened pretty early on in my life. And it just gobbled me up and it took me by storm. And so by the time I was 16, I had done like thousands of readings because I was giving readings from I was 14 up until that time.
Wow. And sorry, I can't help but be curious. I really relate to what you're saying around like that sort of childlike perspective around I want a superpower, and maybe the closest thing I can get to it is these spiritual practices. I'm so curious now that you're so deep into your practice, do you still view these practices in that way of being this superpower? Or do you know, like once you dive in, it becomes more of an academic study, or it becomes more, it becomes more personal. We go through, what is your perspective on it as a superpower now that you're an adult? I'm so curious.
Oh my God, this is magic. We are the natural magicians of antiquity. We are that, and so I sit within my practice each and every day, and I am actively aware that this is still magic. And I'm very wary of expressions of astrology or tarot or runes or any of the multiple things I do. I'm very wary of expressions of them that don't first acknowledge that these are magical skills to have. And I mean, being a practitioner, it feels less magical. Like we don't get the oohs and the ahs that other people get when they see us practice.
Yeah.
But I always try to search for that within myself. And I need to constantly feel as if I'm performing magic within the world. And granted, my approach to astrology is a very specific one. And at the end of the day, there's a part of me that the performative, and I mean, maybe we could talk about this later, but there's two parts to my astrology. There's the helpful part where I'm the astrologer, the counselor, but then there's also the performative part where I am a person demonstrating what the skill of astrology looks like. And I think that performative part is something where I'm searching for like cold, hard facts because I want to match cold facts from this person's chart to the cold facts of their actual life. But it's in the counseling space, I think, where this real magical thing unfolds, where you're holding space for someone else and you're really facilitating a moment out of time for that other person. So it is still magic, even though I've thrown some brains around it.
Yes. Yeah, it's interesting. I had a true sort of, I'm curious to know if you've ever experienced something like this, but I had a really tough time with astrology for the first time this year. I've only been doing it professionally for 4 years. I've only had the Instagram for whatever, 3.5 years. And I was so in love and infatuated with the practice. I mean, for me, I felt like I was catching up for the first few years. Like I said, I think I was called an astrologer before I ever was an astrologer. So since I did grow up in a family full of academics, my imposter syndrome was heavy, where I was like, I got to read everything, and then the further you get down, you do end up reading, works like Lynn Bell, and it gets so deep and so exciting, and that's an awesome experience. But yeah, so I feel like I kind of had like a romantic relationship with astrology maybe up to this year. You know, when I was a novice, it was super romanticized to me. And then even in the first few years of practice, I was just learning so much information that I was just on fire, so excited. Again, it's crazy that you're doing this at such a young age, I'm sure. But yeah, the disillusionment that I experience is similar to what you're describing around it being this superpower, where I feel like the more that I learned, the less I loved the practice, which was really not an intuitive thought of mine. Like I never thought the more I knew, the less I'd like the job, if that made sense.
Yeah.
But my readings at the beginning, you know, like sometimes people title themselves like an intuitive astrologer. The person who is raised in an academic family, that makes me cringe, where I'm like, no, no, no.
Yeah.
You have to know what you're talking about. Like, don't call it in, you know. And so
Yeah.
I felt like this huge need to learn everything that I possibly could, so that just like you're describing, you come prepared to a reading where you're ready to tell the person stuff that's actually born out of the chart, not just born out of intuition. And I felt like my readings at the beginning of my practice, because I was such a novice, they were more guided by intuition, and they were more guided by something that you can't quite put into words. And then as I learned more and more, I felt like I somehow, by turning so much of my left side of my brain on, it was so hard for me to connect emotionally and spiritually in readings. And suddenly the magic, for lack of a better word, of the practice died. And I had this huge existential crisis this year of, what if just the thing went away? Like I felt like I'd never really intentionally became an astrologer in the first place. So it felt very divine. It felt very connected, and all of a sudden that connection got cut off. And so I'm still in this place of reorienting myself with my practice of, I feel like what broke for me is my ego got in the way, because my ego started to say, you know, a lot, you've read a lot of books, you should be super prepared, you shouldn't. And I lost that magic of being curious and being humble and knowing that I don't know everything. And I feel like if there is some, you know, if the planets are talking to us, then all of a sudden the planets are like, she's kind of a dick. Like, I think we need to cut it off. Like, she's done. Like, this is not working anymore. And so I'm just curious. I don't know if you've had any experience of the like, but do you ever struggle with, like, you know, the humanness of us as practitioners versus having that I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think it's a constant struggle, and it's a constant struggle because we can't run away from our humanity, and we're not meant to run away from our humanity. And if astrology does anything at all, or if it is to be considered useful at all, it should be a means of grounding us more into our human experience. And then from that place, giving us the ability to interact with our humanity in a cosmic way.
Mm,
And so I do find myself, and I have found myself in the past, dipping into places of, I guess it's a spiritual boredom of
mm,
sorts, but that only happens when I separate myself from my larger spiritual practices and when it only becomes purely astrology. So,
mm,
so for me, I counter that by coming from other spiritual things that I do. I practice the Kabbalistic tarot, which is heavily astrologically based, but
mm,
it's tarot nonetheless. And there's something about that imaginal world of the tarot that enlivens the astrological practice in ways like astrology itself just doesn't. And I mean, I've had this lifetime of practicing tarot, this lifetime of practicing astrology. And yesterday I was giving a masterclass, or no, it was on Friday, I was giving a masterclass, and I used images from the tarot in order to evoke the sort of meaning that I wanted to share with the students about the astrology. And
yeah.
so I think that you have to find other points of spiritual connection within your life to graft onto the astrology and to re-enliven the astrology. And remember that everything you do feeds your astrology. If you watch the Queen's Gambit on Netflix, that informs your astrology. If you read poetry, that informs your astrology. If you make love, that informs your astrology. Everything we do should inform our astrology, because our astrology is meant to be a container of our lives.
So true. That's beautiful. Yeah.
Did you watch the Queen's Gambit?
No, but you're now the fifth person to recommend it. So I think that's, if you hear it 5 times, it's probably time to start watching it. Yeah. Is it amazing?
Oh my God, it's so amazing. I mean, it's amazing because it speaks to my Saturn and Pluto issues. You know, I have Sun square Saturn and Sun opposing Pluto, so I resonate very deeply with the whole storyline of the Queen's Gambit. And I used to be a professional dancer, and so there's something caught up within me coming from a ballet background of pushing yourself to be the greatest, like that's part and parcel of who I am. And so I really enjoyed the Queen's Gambit because it's about being excellent and losing yourself in that excellence. There's this Sufi quote that says you should dance until you shatter yourself. And I love that so much, because what it means for me is that anything that you do that you love, they have these whirling dervishes, and they spin and they spin and they spin and they spin until they essentially put themselves in a trance. And that's this whole concept of you should dance and you should practice whatever you love until there's no more you that exists. It's just that thing flowing through you. It's just the universe flowing through you. And I think that that's why I love the Queen's Gambit, because it was chess just flowed through her. She became a channel of that chess. And I think that if we can do that with our astrology, then it allows us to jump over this sense of boredom or this sense of not knowing where else to go in our practice, because every time we tap into that astrology, we'll have the entire universe moving through us.
Also, yes. And what really captivates me about you saying that is, so to age myself, and I mean age myself into how damn young I am. I'm going through my Saturn return right now, and I have Moon conjunct Saturn square Pluto opposition Chiron, and it's just a disaster zone. And mommy issues for sure. If you think of it, if you think about astrology.
Yeah.
And so
it was over here.
Yeah, totally. Exactly. So I was like, we are just two sides of a different coin. That's very interesting.
Yeah.
Maybe definitely. I will love it. I'll let you know.
And I mean, also, just, full disclosure, I'm going through my Saturn return as well, because I'm 28.
Well, but you are 28 going on thousands of years old, because you've been doing this since you were a teenager. So that's that. But anyways, that's awesome.
Cool.
Wait,
cool.
so
tell me.
Anyway, no, you go ahead. You direct.
No, you go ahead. You tell me.
I was just curious, are you feeling your Saturn return? And you can bring astrology into it if you want to, of exactly what's happening, but are you feeling yours?
Yeah, I have this theory, and it works for me, and it's something that I teach my students over at my school, Oraculos, that Saturn, when it passes over everything within your chart one time, it crystallizes all of those things that your chart says. It crystallizes all of those components of your quote unquote natal promise. And at this point in my life, there is nothing else for Saturn to pass over other than Saturn, basically. So I feel as if much of my natal promise has already crystallized. I've gone through the full gamut of my chart. I know what each of those planets in my chart mean, because they've all been Saturned, which means they've all been brought into physical reality.
Oh.
And so now, with this Saturn return coming up, besides the fact that I'm a Saturnian person to a large degree in general, and I mean, there's all of the things you could say about a Saturn person or someone who has the sun and the moon with Saturn or whatever, I embody that to a large degree. And at the same time, I feel settled and I feel grounded, and I know what I do and I know what I practice, and I know what works, I think a gift of coming in at such a young age is that I had my entire childhood to do all of the things and to explore all of the things. And so coming into my 20s, I already knew the shape of the practice that I brought to the world. And I do feel old, like I do feel like an old person in a young person's body because I've seen so much and I've done so much, and now I'm in a space where I'm just sharing and I'm just teaching people because I want to get this information out of me. For some other more probably sad, tragic reasons, but whatever, we can talk about that. We can talk about it. But I'm in a dissemination phase. I want to get it all out because I would hate to die without having gived back to the universe what the universe gave to me.
Oh, that's really good.
It's really sad. Tell us, Nadine, so you got into your astrology, you got into your astrology designing, and so how do you think you kind of navigated your way beyond that feeling as if the voice had turned off, or beyond that feeling of really sitting in the heart of the cosmos and being spoken to by the cosmos? Because I mean, it does happen. Not every day is going to feel as magical as the other days. And some days it's like, oh my God, is this thing really real? Am I really the one who should be bringing this to people? How do you think you navigated that for yourself?
Such a good question. It's also really new. So I would say maybe the answer I give you today, maybe we talk in 6 months and I have a totally different answer for you. So I'll just make a disclaimer that it's new. But so I love that you brought up the idea of like integrating other spiritual practices to inform your astrology practice. Like I got sober this year from an addiction, and I won't go too much into that, but it really shifted my perspective around, everything. So first of all, I would say, but I had this really crazy kind of spiritual experience where so there was a point this year where I said, I'm ready to quit. Like that, to be totally candid, I was like, all right, I'm not going to be an astrologer anymore. This isn't working for me. It was just a fluke, in my life's journey. I'll just be like, wasn't that funny? One day, at one point I was an astrologer. And, it was weird. I was like taking a shower, and all of a sudden I had this moment where I felt this, okay, so I love to write. I think that's one of the places I'm the clearest channels if I'm writing about astrology. I love readings. I think that is a place where I can channel, but I think I'm my best when I'm writing. And usually what happens is like all of a sudden there are words in my head, like it literally I can see the text, and then all I have to do is sit down and type it out. And like I told you, I think my ego was a huge issue in my practice where like, I grew up, by the way, in a family full of atheists who despise astrology. And so, I was very much taught like this idea of self-reliance and like you earned your success and you created your life and it's a very sort of like me mentality, a survival mentality. And so I think I did have this weird story in my head that like I was responsible for my success as an astrologer. And that's like a double-edged sword. Like the upside to that is you're like, I'm special. And then the downside to that is when you fail, you're the failure and you are the worst. So basically one night I'm ready to quit. I'm like, this is too hard. It's not working for me. It's not benefiting anyone. And I get in the shower in this like presence. And by the way, I didn't see anything. It was just a feeling. And all of a sudden the words formed in my head like they do normally. And it was this story where this being, I don't know what it is, said to me for the first time of like, do you know how lucky we are to be in communication with the planets? And it's funny because I know that's so simple, but it had never occurred to me. And what I mean by that is I think, and I don't think I'm alone in this, I think a lot of us come to astrology for self-exploration, where we're like, what's my sun sign? What's my moon sign? What's my rising sign? It's a very sort of self-reflective practice at the beginning. And so I'd never pondered like, what does it mean that I know what my sun and my moon is? And what does it mean about my connection? I literally just never thought about the grander idea of how humans are relating to the practice of astrology. And so something clicked into the motion for the first time where I felt right sized, for lack of a better word, where I was like, oh, I'm not some special person who understands astrology, nor am I a piece of shit who should quit astrology. Maybe I'm just a human being who, on my best day, where I'm humble enough to listen, I can understand what these celestial bodies are potentially communicating, or you want to think about it from a different perspective, like what their cycles are saying about our cycles, however you view or interpret like the origins of astrology. And it was this break that I cried so hard for about 2 hours because it was really relieving. Like, I think I just been living sort of in the state of fear of like, either I'm going to make or break my practice because it's a me issue. And then I had this moment where I was like, no, 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 no. I need to like actually broaden my relationship with astrology and view it much more as a spiritual practice than anything else. And so the way that I've been navigating it currently is I have been engaging with tarot for the first time, which has been really cool. I think it's opening up that space again of wondering, and the space of sort of like, for lack of a better term, like exciting sort of unpredictability that I didn't have in astrology up to that point, and I think the main thing I'm the most excited about is just knowing that I know nothing, and that feels really, really freeing. And knowing that there's so many different ways to interpret one horoscope. There's no right way to explain a transit. There's no right way to explain a chart. And sort of, I feel like in a good way, my world's opened up again, where I think I was trying to master astrology in the best way that I could. And my world got smaller and smaller. My practice got smaller and smaller and smaller. And all of a sudden, like, it feels suddenly like things are opening up. And that's as far as I've gotten. So I would say, what I feel very sure about is I'm just at the beginning of understanding where this is going. But I think like what I've experienced this year was just the death of an ego. And there's many more egos to kill along the way, nor is the ego ever killed. And there's great uses for an ego. And I'm not at all trying to live in this like higher state where I don't have an ego. That's impossible. But I think that this is just the beginning of sort of like a new chapter in how I relate to astrology. So I don't know. That's where I'm at so far.
Well, I think that's a pretty cool place to be at. And thank you so much for sharing that. Because, yeah, I've said to my students before that our astrology shouldn't limit our universe. Our universe should expand our astrology. And one of the downfalls of a very academic, intellectualized approach to astrology, in my opinion, as someone who has for a long time in my life practiced in that way, is that it has the ability of tricking us into believing that we actually know something about anything. Like we get so caught, like we get so caught up in our particular understanding of what Mars square Pluto means, or of what Sun square Saturn or Moon conjunct Saturn sort of means, that we fall into that very tiny, narrow framework that blocks us. And I think the thing that comes up, that rears its ugly head when we feel like we're not good enough to practice astrology, or we're not this enough, or we're not whatever enough, is this thing of having allowed our astrology to become blocked up by ourselves. We stand in the way of that celestial communication. So I love what it is you said, that you had these words flood through you again, that is there no greater delight than this, to be able to hold space with the planets and to be able to see ourselves in the planets, and for the planets to see themselves within us. I mean, is there no greater testament to our own celestial ancestry in the stars, to realize that those planets are actually our grandparents, and those planets are our cosmic progenitors, and we see ourselves in them because we are made up of those planetary forces, and our lives are a crystallization of those planetary forces in dynamic action. It's a beautiful thing when we can look upwards and see the reflection of ourselves. And I think that that sounds like the place where you're at right now. And I just wish you Godspeed in really continuing to plug into that, because that is what our astrology is meant to show us. It's meant to show us the reflection of ourselves in the cosmos around us. So,
Yes.
so you're in a good place, and I also think that the person who doesn't experience doubt at some level, not necessarily constantly, but if you don't have a good measure of doubt that's always within you, then it causes you to start to think that you are the source
Yep.
of
Yes.
this knowledge, and that becomes a slippery slope.
Oh, such a slippery slope. And that's why I think, just for sake of conversation, like the mass popularity of astrology and also, new forms of technology like Instagram, like YouTube. I think that the reason why I want to speak openly about all of these struggles is I can't imagine I'm the only person who's grappling with this, because when you have even whatever 1,000 people on Instagram engaging with your platform, whoever you are, I think there's that weird sense of, even if you don't think that it's coming from you, other people think that it's coming from you. And that's a weird thing I've been also trying to navigate, is like, where's the balance, and where can these tools and these platforms be used productively? Because it can so easily get to that place of over glorification, thinking that this person is a guru or that this person knows everything, just purely based off of just how these tools work. The number of likes, engagements, followers you have says something about your credibility, but it doesn't say anything about your credibility. Do you know what I mean? So like, that's been another sort of interesting, very human problem that I think we should start talking about as a community, is like, what does it mean when we all have the ability and the capacity to get these huge followings? How do we use them productively? And the answer to that, I think, is yet to be told, but I think it is an interesting thing to begin thinking about.
Well, let's talk about using platforms productively, because I know that this year in particular, you have really done the lion's share in terms of holding space via the platforms that you have. And I just want to say thank you, because you've also held space for me via your platforms, and particularly some work that I did earlier in the year with the Black Astrologers Roundtable and all of that. So thank you so much. But I know that you've been using your platforms to hold space for these larger conversations in society in general, conversations having to do with social justice, conversations having to do with politics, encouraging people to go out and vote, because that is all of our duty in a democracy, to go out and express this right to vote. Why do you think that was such an important thing for you to tap into, particularly this year?
Well, I think that's, as I was describing this like crisis of consciousness in my practice, I think the upside to that is I think it did break apart a lot of the ideas of what my practice had to be. Because I think I had this idea of my only job is to write horoscopes and to do readings and to build the most successful business that I can. It was a very me mentality. And I think by losing this idea, I think I just, in a good way, detached from my practice for the first time this year, where I realized, like, I never built this thing to begin with. It's so lucky. And, the Instagram's sort of a crapshoot in the sense that some people become successful who shouldn't be, and then other people should be successful. They're not successful on Instagram, and yada, yada, yada. And I lived in a lot of fear. I lived in a lot of it's interesting. I've been thinking a lot about like the Capricorn transits of just obviously Pluto being Capricorn since 2008, Saturn and Jupiter being here over the past year. I've explained this a lot to my partner, but like a lot of my astrology practice was kind of rooted in my own therapy practice where I was very into I used to write a ton about self-care, a ton about, kind of like looking at your own emotional stuff. I felt really comfortable writing in that voice, of sort of like, look at your inner demons. And not that there isn't something beautiful about that type of astrology. I think it's awesome. But I had some sort of aha moment, particularly during the George Floyd protests, where I just realized it was a very meta moment where I was like, there's no way I can write about this transit and not talk about what's happening in the world. There's just no way there's no way that I can turn this. I can't talk about Saturn and Aquarius without talking about what's happening in other people's lives, not just in your own singular vortex of an experience. I'm using my body to that's how I used to view astrology. Is I just thought it was an inward thing. And the inward thing is so necessary. We have to continue doing the unpacking, the dismantling within our own lives, our own trauma, our own feelings. Absolutely. But I think the thing that I've been so inspired by is the fact that we've been here before. The last time Saturn was in Aquarius was in 1993, which was when it was apartheid. By 94, when Saturn left Aquarius, then Nelson Mandela was elected. Rodney King riots in the US, and we've been here. And so I think I just had this moment where I just felt like I can't write about the astrology of today unless I start writing about it differently. And it was a very personal process. I was in a very victimized, very self-centered place. It was necessary. I can't look back on the period of time. And I think I had to go through tons of therapy, tons of my own sort of like feeling sorry for myself in order to get to a place where I was like, whoa, there's something going on that's far greater than me. And so that's how I started talking about things like Black Lives Matter, things like just racial injustice in the US in general. And so much of my white fragility come up. I'd be lying if I said it was like a walk in the park where I was like, oh, it's so easy. And I'm such a it was so easy to talk about. It was terrifying. But at the same time, how could I be an astrologer talking about the astrology of today unless I went there? And so that's where I've come to at this point. Is for the first time, I want to start talking about my own stuff around astrology and being a white practitioner, but also the scope of which I see astrology is subjective, as is yours, as is anyone's. And so the fact that, for better or for worse, I think at least Western astrology is predominantly white. I think that that's something we have to be talking about. If we are predominantly the people speaking about it, talking about it, writing about it, we might not be seeing everything. So we have to let other voices into the space who can talk about these transits in a deeper and more, and from all the different lenses, so that people can get a holistic view of what Saturn and Aquarius means. Because the way I write about Saturn and Aquarius, the truth of the matter is coming from a white place. It's coming from my privilege. And so the thing that I'm most excited about now is viewing this platform not as my platform anymore, but viewing it as a platform. And this idea of bringing in other people onto the platform so that we can get other people engaging with more astrologers. Like, I think if nothing else, the most simple thing I've been thinking a lot about is we should never just follow one astrologer, because that's just one perspective. You cannot get a holistic perspective on an eclipse unless you read multiple interpretations of the same eclipse. So I don't know. I'd love to know your thoughts on that. That's been kind of my thoughts on it so far.
I think 2020 has definitely opened up the field for more people to be interested in the opinions that other astrologers have, who either don't really have the biggest platform, or they're people of color, or they're queer, or whatever the multiple ways in which people can be othered in society are. I think that 2020 has definitely opened up the realm for everyone to want to listen to the opinions of everyone else. because for a long time it has just been, people listening to the opinions of the astrological oligarch, and
Yes.
that was that was your one source of information, which was inevitably going to be not a person of color, and inevitably going to be a lot of other things. And truthfully, at the end of the day, I don't necessarily think that there's anything wrong with a white astrologer having a platform where they have thousands of people who listen to them and who plug into their work. But it's just making sure that you, and not necessarily you specifically, but anyone who has that platform, stands in a place of responsibility and realizes that you lose nothing if you open up wider conversations.
Totally.
And the breadth of the conversations that have been happening this year has been stark in comparison to that same breadth of conversations happening before, because I think now more people are willing to listen to other voices of people of color, voices of queer people, voices of people who've been marginalized. And I think the other side of that is that not every person of color practicing astrology really has the greatest grasp of their astrology. And I think we also have to be aware of that, because I do think that there's people who have taken advantage of the wave of sympathy coming in the direction of the Black and the POC and the Indigenous community, and they've really been riding it. And they're not really in the greatest place of preparation, or they haven't done all the groundwork, or they just haven't put in the hours, or they haven't put in their 7 pounds of flesh to really, and I'm really conscious about how I'm speaking about that as well. But at the same time, we have brilliant astrologers who deserve platforms and who deserve voices. And I think that those people who are out there, now is the time. And this year they've been heard. And it's a wonderful thing to be alive at this moment, when people are willing to look beyond their prejudices and are willing to listen for wisdom, wherever wisdom comes from.
Right. Yeah, and it makes me think a lot about, she was part of your podcast, Mecca Woods.
Today is her birthday.
Oh my gosh, happy birthday, Mecca. She said something I thought that was so spot on about the astrology of, particular, she was talking about the conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter and Aquarius. And she was saying, I'm going to butcher her words, so please go see exactly what she said. But what I took from it was that conjunction and what people are calling the age of Aquarius and like the transits that are coming up. It's not some like aha moment where everyone's going to change overnight and everything's going to be beautiful and wonderful and there's going to be equality and everything like that. I think what I so resonated with what she was talking about is we're back where we were. We've been here before. Transits are cyclical. This is not new news. It's a new opportunity to show up to the same problem in a different way and approach it from a new perspective. But also, like, Aquarius is a fixed sign. It's going to be squaring Uranus throughout the year. There's going to be the rubber is going to meet the road many times throughout the next couple of years. And so what I hope is that the astrology of Saturn and Jupiter and Aquarius does not sound like change. It sounds like, no, it's time to begin actually putting action into everything that you might have uncovered and discovered throughout 2020. Because at least the way I saw it is like, it does feel like some type of emotional, and also like, societal and systemic bottom. And so now is the time to begin to rethink and reevaluate the things that we're prioritizing in our individual lives as well as collectively. But I love what she said, because it brings up the point of like, there's so much left to be done. It's like, we're not even scratching the surface of what needs to change. And so I think when you said that I agree with you about this idea of like, people need to study astrology in a real way and make sure that they're ready to take on a platform. I absolutely agree with that. And I think that that's still a part of Saturn. Like, if you do follow traditional astrology, then Saturn does rule Aquarius, right? So it still has a serious tone to it. We all need to be, I think, be the most sort of like thorough and diligent version of ourselves. So yeah, the sort of upward battle is still absolutely happening. I don't think it's like 2020 and now we're just on this upward cycle. I think it's more work. It's just going to maybe be slightly different, and maybe, I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, Aquarius is a fixed air sign, I think, just as a point of fact.
Right.
And with the fixed air energy, there's always this concept of fixing a particular way of thinking, or of fixing a particular mind frame. And as we move into 2021, I think what we're being challenged to do in this time of Saturn and Jupiter in Aquarius is to really fix a new thought, or fix a new vision, or concretize the sorts of things that came up in 2020 that we realized, hey, these things don't work. 2020 is a year of burning. We've burned so much this year, physically, emotionally, spiritually. We've burned things out of our systems. And I mean, we're currently in eclipse season, so we're still burning things out of our systems. But we've burnt and we've let go of so much this year. And so now we have this platform moving into this Saturn and Aquarius time to crystallize a new vision of what the future is meant to look like. And 2020 felt like pressure and fire. On the one end we have the Saturn, which is this great amount of pressure, and then Pluto. People compare Pluto to a volcano, so there's been this pressure and this fire that's been here all year long. But what gets created through pressure and fire are diamonds and gems and crystals. And so we have this ability to take these gems and to take these diamonds that we've cultivated out of 2020, as hard as it's been, regardless of how much pressure that we've been put to, regardless of how much fire we've gone through, we've come out with some very rarefied jewels that we're meant to establish in the crown of 2021. And if we can take these things forward with us, then we stand a chance to really crystallize a new vision for who society can be and for who we can be individually within it. So I'm excited about the future, and I'm excited about establishing a new vision for tomorrow. And I'm excited that it does feel, in a sense, like a quote unquote new world order. if there's that, yeah, because all of that is necessary. And I think that 2020 has shown us that there must be another way in which we organize ourselves within this world. There must be other values in society that we organize ourselves around, other than the ones passed on to us by our ancestors who didn't know shit about anything. So I'm really excited about seeing the new values that we build in 2021, and how those values lead us towards a more futuristic, a more evolutionary version of our human beingness while on this earth.
Yes.
Yeah. Wow. Nadine, this has been so cool. And I mean, there's so much more that I want to talk to you about. First of all, tell us about your podcast. Tell us where we can find and listen to your podcast all across the interwebs, so that our listeners and viewers can go and check you out.
So I have a podcast called What Time Was I Born? I only did one season, and it's basically a podcast where I interviewed people about their birth chart. It's essentially, imagine doing a live reading, but you allow the client to give a lot more feedback on their life and their lived experiences of the birth chart. The reason why I only did one season is I just am not sure I want to take season 2. So I would say to be decided on if there even is a second season. But if you want to listen to the first season, it's on Spotify and Apple, I think a number of other platforms. Yes.
All right, awesome sauce. And talk to us about your upcoming book, because I know that we still can't really spill the tea on the entire thing, but tell us what you can about your upcoming book project.
So it's gonna I'll tell you funny details. That's not giving away too much. It's gonna be so long. It'll be more like imagine the length of a textbook, but it's by no means like it's not an academic read. So I will say that it's not for the practicing astrologer. I would say it's more for the beginner, the person who just is curious about the spiritual practices. The other interesting thing that I will say is it's not just about astrology, which was exactly what you and I talked about today, of expanding my world a little bit. So this has been a cool challenge of a book, which I'm pretty excited about. And I think that's all I can say. Yeah, I'll stop there before I say too much about it. My publisher is like, excuse me.
Okay, cool. Well, guess what? I'm super excited to pick up a copy of your book. Do you know when it may be released, or is that also under wraps?
No, I think I can say that in theory, fall of 2022. So if I can get my shit together, fall of 2022.
Good stuff. I mean, I love how this process of book writing forces all of us to get our shit together.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, like, are you on a timeline of your own, or, a timeline of someone else's?
Well, the timeline is essentially one of my own making, but I have publishers, and I have publishers within the astrological community who want to publish my thoughts and who are really great supporters of my work. And I love them for that, because before, I dare say, the last 2 years, like, I was pretty unknown. I was just in the Bahamas in my pajamas doing my astrology, and no one in the wider astrological world really knew about me until literally 2018, when people started to pick up on my work. And so I'm really humbled that I have people wanting to hold space for the work that I do.
Can I know what your book is about? How much can you talk about it?
Okay, so you need to know that based on my very mutable dilemma,
Yeah.
because I have a very mutable as fuck chart.
Yes, you do.
It has shifted gears twice, and the two times it shifted is, one, I initially wanted to write a book about the Kabbalistic tarot, and about how the Kabbalistic tarot is essentially the astrologer's field guide to the cosmos. It's like the pictographic field guide to the cosmos, this concept of fusing the Kabbalah and the tarot, which is what happened early in the 20th century and the late 19th century with the Golden Dawn, and them creating different tarot decks and disseminating that knowledge that was astrologically based. And so I really wanted to bring that into the contemporary world, because there's a lot of books about tarot out there, and there's a lot of books about tarot and astrology that's been written by people who aren't actually astrologers. So there's a lot of tarot readers who write books about tarot and astrology who don't have the tarot, or rather who don't have the astrological background, or who either don't know the real roots of how those two systems actually come together. And I know that the information that I've codified within myself is something that hasn't been heard. So there was the Kabbalistic tarot book. However, I was like, Mychal, but like you've really been trudging in the astrology for a while, and people, if you're going to write a book about the Kabbalistic tarot, you should first write a book about astrology. And then I figured, okay, well, let me write a book about horary astrology, which is the divinational branch of astrology, because people don't really know about that a lot, and people don't really know how you practice it. So write about that. Right. And so we got about 50% through the writing of that book, and I'm saying we because it's a team of us. Right. And then someone said, Mychal, you do realize that this book probably won't have that many sales because people don't know what horary astrology is. Mm-hmm. So why don't you just write a book about astrology in general? I teach a course. It's called Foundations of Classical Astrology, and it's a 4-month semester program, and it's in the fall, and it's going to be again in January. Mm-hmm. And I figured, why not just put that course in book form?
Totally.
Because the Saturn in me forces me to type out a book. Every single semester I teach this, I type out an entire book of over 150 pages, and I never use the one from the year before. So every year I'm typing out this 150.
You've already written many books.
Precisely. So, so at this moment, the specific book project that I'm working on is pretty much just typing out my first semester, putting it into a book form that people can take, and that at the very minimum, I can sell that to my students. But I think that that's really my most important contribution right now, like giving people a book that outlines my approach to astrology and why that's meaningful.
That's so cool. And so you said 2021 pending?
2021 is the deadline that everyone's given to me. And so I at least have to have a first draft in a publisher's hands in 2021. And we're pretty close to that. So I'm excited about my book. I'm also excited about yours. And I'll send you the draft so that you could give it a read and let me know what you think.
I would love to. Amazing.
Awesome sauce. Nadine, this has been so cool. I'm really excited. And we didn't speak about half of the things I thought we'd speak about, but we definitely spoke about a lot. And I am thrilled and honored to be in this space with you. And I'm also really humbled that you would share a vulnerable space with me, because it's really important that we can be human with each other and vulnerable with each other. And your story is all of our stories. And thank you for giving words to that.
God, of course. Thank you so much for having me and for creating a safe space, because I definitely felt like I could share. So thank you so much.
Awesome sauce. Well, Nadine, is there anything else that you want to tell our viewers and listeners in terms of where they can reach you? I know that you said that you're taking this bit of a sabbatical, but
Right.
if people do want to plug more deeply into your work, is there a website they can go to, or how can we stay in contact with you?
I think Instagram's probably the best way these days. Like, I think that's probably the safest bet. So I think you said at the beginning, but just Nadine Jane _astrology. I think that's kind of like the hub of everything, is probably the Instagram.
Good stuff. So I'm going to put all of your contact info down below in the description box so that our viewers and listeners can plug more deeply into your amazing work, because I plugged into it and I know so many people who do, and you're deeply loved, and you should know that in the middle of all of the feelings that you feel, which are completely normal, you are loved and you are appreciated, and your work makes a difference in the lives of others. So thank you so much for the work that you do.
Thank you so much for the work that you do.
You're very welcome. And to those of our viewers and listeners out there, if this is your 100th time joining us here on the Oraculos podcast, or if this is time number 1, I just want to say thank you from the bottom of my heart for continuing to come here and share in this virtual astrological space. I receive your support, I receive your kindness, I receive your feedback, but most importantly, I receive your love. So if you want to continue to be a part of the magic and the momentum that we're building here on the Oraculos podcast, please do, yes, go below and like what has been an amazing interview. But also subscribe to the Oraculos podcast and share this podcast with your other astrologically and magically minded friends, because more and more people need to know about these amazing conversations that we're having with these amazing astrologers from around the world. So until next time, I'm your host, Mychal A. Bryan, leaving you in love and peace and hope. Until we meet again, have a good one. Bye-bye. Nadine Jane.
Yay! Thank you so much.
We did that.
I was going to say it wasn't a light interview, that's for sure.
We did it.